Okay, good morning. So it's a little bit like church on Sunday morning. Everybody's kind of migrating to the back. I don't know, General McGee, whether they think we're gonna send the collection plate around or something like that. He's hiding in the back. Well, good morning, and for most of you, many of you, welcome back to your association, the Association of the United States Army. We're happy to host this breakfast and continue this relationship. A thanks to Brad and Jeremiah for putting this together and getting us all at the same place at the same time. And I know as many of you are nearing the end of your fellowships and getting ready to move on to other things, who better to talk to us this morning than Major General J.P. McGee. As you know, as you've been watching the Army, you know that when the chief came in 2015, laser focused on readiness, on current readiness, and building the capabilities of our Army to meet current demands. And you've heard his speeches, you've read his papers, you've seen all the effort that the Army has put into building readiness. And you've seen over the past couple of years with the establishment of the cross-functional teams, then Army Futures Command, a shift from near-term readiness, current readiness, to start building future readiness, and the concerted effort of modernization to meet a very different operational demand and strategic demand that the Army will be called on to meet. And I think now we're just entering what I think is probably the next phase of modernization, and that's modernization of people, which as you know, that and Joe McGee will walk us through that, but that's the Army, right? I mean, our fighting platform is the individual soldier, and that's what distinguishes, I think, the Army perhaps from some of the other services, particularly the Navy and the Air Force, which tend to be equipment platform centric. We're people centric, but yet our practices, our methodologies, our policies, and in some cases laws, have not kept pace with the changing world. So the Secretary and the Chief, being smarter than the average bears, say this is important and we've got to put some institutional energy behind it. And so the strategic direction obviously comes from them, from the Secretary, from the Chief, from the Sergeant Major of the Army, and then the others. And they say, well, we really need somebody to lead this effort. And so where else would you go to somebody to lead the talent management task force than to go to the J3 of Army Cyber Command? Because of course that's just such a logical fit, right? And who should be the J3 of Cyber Command except for a distinguished combat infantryman? Because again, that's such a natural fit, right? I think what that speaks to is that in many ways General McGee is a poster child for the kinds of talent management processes and policies that we ought to think about. And instead of thinking exclusively about J.P. McGee as a combat infantryman, as a paratrooper, as a ranger, as somebody who fits neatly into a very traditional Army box, the senior leaders of the Army said, hey, here is someone who has some extraordinary talents that can be useful in perhaps non-traditional ways. I suspect you were probably outside of your comfort zone at Cyber Command, and that's a good thing, and perhaps something that each of us ought to start to reconcile ourselves with, is that you are going to increasingly be placed in positions where you are not comfortable, and that's a good thing. But currently, I got to tell you, as an old soldier and having the opportunity here at AUSA to see much of the Army, there's no one better to be leading the talent management task force than Major General J.P. McGee. He understands soldiers and he understands soldiering. He's open to new ideas. He's thoughtful, and I think this is exactly the kind of leader that the Chief and the Secretary were looking for to lead the talent management task force. This is what's going to affect your life going forward in your profession. And so we're very honored this morning to have General McGee. And JP, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Sir, thank you very much. So General Ham, that makes me think of a quick story. I was wandering through the Pentagon about 2 weeks ago, and I bumped into a buddy of mine who is a peer. He had just been pinned on 2 stars. He just got pinned on Friday. He pulled me aside. He said, "What are you doing right now?" And I said, "Well, I'm the director of the Army's Talent Management Task Force." And he says, "My God," he said, "Army Cyber last job, Talent Management Task Force this job." He says, "When is the Army going to stop giving you goofy jobs?" And the fact of the matter is these jobs have been tremendous. They've been broadening, they've been challenging, and I can't think of anything more important that I've been able to do in the Army other than leading soldiers in combat than being the director of this task force. So what I'd like to do for the next about 25, 30 minutes is give you the standard pitch on talent management and then spend the rest of the time answering your questions, taking your inputs. If I say something, I say that you don't understand, please raise your hand. I can explain a little bit more, but it sort of flows, and I think it will answer most of your questions, and then we can get into a deeper conversation about anything you'd like to talk about. Next slide, please. Okay, so as General Ham highlighted, we are going through this Army transformation. We've got multi-domain operations. We've got this new acquisition and ways of looking at the future being headed by Army Futures Command. But really at the center of everything that the Army does is our people. And the Army's Talent Management Task Force has that mission of determining what is going to be the new system by which we manage the officer corps in the future. I want to state up front that the guidance is very, very clear that we are not to take the current system and make some very minor 10% sort of improvement. This isn't about changing a block on the OER. This is a fundamental transformation of how we manage officers. And the more I get into this job, the more I see how this is a really, really different way of managing our officer corps. It will next translate to the NCOs who have already moved out, if you look what Sergeant Major Daly's doing, and then eventually to civilians. It's a new concept when you talk about how we do talent management. I want you just to think about the systems that we operate right now and the history for them, okay? So the first formative piece of legislation that defined the system that we run right now was written in 1947. It's the Officer Personnel Act in the immediately aftermath after World War II, with the creation of the Air Force and this new joint requirement. So that was the first one. In 1980, there was the Defense Officers Personnel Management Act, which made some changes, but it codified things like up or out. It codified very rigid timelines. It did a number of these things for reasons that it was very vested in an industrial-based approach. And so an industrial-based approach, if you look at it, says that what's important is mass production. What it says is to make a number of interchangeable parts in order to be rapidly expandable. And what it says is that really the institution's role is to take someone, develop them, make them all sort of look the same so you can stick an infantry captain and an infantry captain and an infantry captain, and they're all sort of roughly the same. But the foundational principles of what we're executing right now as the way we manage our officer corps really was written in 1947. So what we've been told is to develop a new officer management system based on the principles of talent management. If you understand the concepts and principles of talent management, what that says is something very different. It says each of us have talents, and we define those talents as the unique combination of knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences. And it's the institution's responsibility to first determine what your talents are, develop certain talents, and then find out where you as an individual can best go within the organization so you can take your talents and contribute in the maximum fashion towards the accomplishment of the mission. This is a very different way because it means that every infantry captain isn't interchangeable, and it takes some of your uniqueness. It's got to be enabled by information technology. It's got to be enabled by a whole lot of things, but that's the fundamental shift that we're talking about when we talk about a new officer management system. If there is a mantra or sort of a way of looking at it within talent management, we talk about having the right officer at the right assignment, the right time, overtime. And people will say to me, as they've said before, they say, JP, we already do a talent management system. I'm a 3-star general. I was managed like this. And I would argue that we do have a talent management system, but it's generally for very small populations. If you're an AUSA in the Army, you're talent management. If you're a FAO in the Army, you're a talent manager. If you're a general officer, one of the 301 active duty general officers, I would argue you are a talent manager. But what we don't have is an institutional capacity. And the thing that we're missing, at least as a first step, is a granular level of information about every single officer who is in our inventory. So beyond your date of rank and your MOS and what schools you've gone to, but a really deep level of information about you so we can figure out where you best go into the organization. A lot of people say, hey, this is all about making the general officer corps and making it better. And I would say, yes, that's a part of it. But I would argue that the biggest impact that you're going to find, the greatest return on the investment, is not the top 5% of the officer corps, however you want to define that. We can talk about that because I think we tend to do that in a very arbitrary way. But really, it's the management of the top 6 to 60% of the officers. That sort of vast middle that we sometimes struggle to figure out where they can go and where their skills are best applied to accomplish our mission. And I think that's where you're going to get the greatest return on investment. The guidance from the chief and the secretary have been very clear. They have said not to just take the current system and make a 10% improvement on it, not to just tweak the current system, not to change these processes, but to make a radically new and different and better system for the Army. Okay, and that is hard for all of us. I mean, we continue to sort of revert back, and we have to discipline ourselves to revert back to what we know and the models that we've grown up in and say, no, this doesn't apply anymore. We've got to find something completely different and then chart the course for us to be able to get there. The example I like to use is if you went to Mercedes-Benz and you took a bunch of Mercedes-Benz engineers and you said Mercedes-Benz average miles per gallon is 50 miles per gallon. We want you guys to come back and tell us how our engines can get a 10% improvement in their fuel efficiency. We want to get to 55. They'd go to some offsite, they'd make some changes, they'd figure out some new schematics to make the valves tighter and tighten up some hoses, they'd do some mechanical things, and they'd be able to get you to 55 miles per gallon. But if you took those same engineers and said the goal for Mercedes-Benz is for us to be able to have an average miles per gallon of 500 miles per gallon per engine, okay, that would require them to look at everything differently. Right? Like they would have to fundamentally question, what is an engine? How does a car relate to it in its different pieces? I just learned this fact a little while ago, just so you know, 55% of miles per gallon of an engine comes from the engine. 45% of it comes from environmental factors like how you drive, where you're driving, stuff like that. So I think that's a fairly good analogy, but our mission has been to get to that 500 miles per gallon, not to just do the 10% tweaks on the margins, which frankly is really the way that we've all been sort of raised as Army officers, right? Like you take over an S3, you don't radically change what an S3 does, you don't really radically change what a battalion does, you try to make it better, more efficient on the margins. At the first, we had said that this was going to require us to change Army culture. This is actually an old slide, but what it really requires us, we've changed this now, is what we're actually doing is we're going to start challenging the cultural norms of the Army today. Because as we look at some of these things, we're going to talk about doing things that the Army has done before. So in World War II, when we were really at risk for national survival, we had no problems direct commissioning in high-quality civilians and making them lieutenant colonels, colonels, generals, because they brought a skill set that our Army needed to win a war for national survival. Okay, now we haven't experienced that. We're not used to direct commissioning, but a lot of the things that we're going to look at, and a lot of the things we're going to discuss, are things that are not new to our Army, but they are new to us. And so we're really not changing the Army culture. We're not talking about changing what the values of the Army are, what the mission of the Army are, but we're talking about changing some of the cultural norms instead. And so we can highlight some of that as we're going along. Why do we need a new system? Because people define our Army. We want to retain our position as a premier human development organization within the world, and it's tough to do that with a model that's based on 1947 sort of systems. Talent management, we think, gives us a decisive advantage against near-peer adversaries. As near-peer adversaries get larger economies, as the technological edge starts to get smaller and smaller, one of the advantages we have in our people, and specifically our willingness of our people in American society to share information with institutions. And so we can see them better, apply them better. That's something probably that's not going to happen in China, where some of these skills that would be professed by their people might be viewed as threats to the regime. Same thing in places like North Korea. And so in the area where we start to have dwindling advantages in some of the things we've traditionally had, size, economy, and technology, this might be an advantage where we can actually get the most out of our people in terms of how we employ our officer corps. The other piece of it is that we are experiencing today the slowest rate of technological change that we will experience from this day forward. And said another way, every single day from today, the rate of technological change is going to get faster. Okay? And we need to have an officer management system and a personnel system that can accommodate that. People will point to the examples of cyber and talk about how we do with cyber, but let's look at how cyber came into the Army. It came in and we already had a sort of cadre of people who had worked at the NSA and Intel jobs. We had people who were signalers who had run networks for decades. And so we sort of had a base of people who were already ready to sort of take this and morph into cyber. And that was really hard to do for any of those who were there for that transition. But you think about these things that are coming to us very, very rapidly and in no particular order: artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, biological engineering, robotics. We've got really no skill set, at least no depth of talent from which we can draw. We don't have the equivalent of the intel and signal officers where we can go, oh, okay, you're going to be our new nanotechnology guy. Like, we don't have that resident within our force today. So we've got to have a system now that can start changing and be able to adapt those technologies so we can take the strength of our nation, which is, some of these advances and some of these things that are happening in the civilian world, and be able to integrate them and make them a strength of our Army. The final piece, and I think some of you guys are living this right now, certainly those of you who are number, is there changing generational norms in terms of what you expect to have out of a career. So there's much greater flexibility nowadays that is afforded to people who are in the civilian workforce. They don't just go work for IBM and retire after 35 years with a gold watch. They hop from company to company. They're looking for diversity of jobs and experiences. We are seeing the rise of the professional spouse, and the professional spouse means a spouse with a profession, not what you sort of had in my day, which was the spouse's profession was to be the Army spouse. And that was just sort of the expectation. Increasingly, this is causing a lot of tension with many of our highly talented junior officers on whether they can stay or go, as their spouses have co-equal careers and sometimes making more money than they are, and they've got to make these very tough decisions against a very rigid system that we run right now, which doesn't really take those things into account. So that's one of the things amongst many that we need to take into account. And then the final observation I will give you is, as we talk about this, everybody wants to talk about I and me, and they want to talk about their personal experiences. And I will just tell you that I'm interested in hearing about your personal experiences, but I'm really more interested in hearing about the information. Because the way you were treated might be very different than the way we're treating 90,000 active duty officers and 156,000 active Guard and Reserve officers. My best example, I was talking to Rand about a month and a half ago. A distinguished elderly gentleman raised his hand and he said, the Army has a significant problem with how you write your evaluation reports. I said, sir, okay, I'm not saying we don't, but what would be your evidence for that? Like, why do you say that? He said, well, I was an orderly in a company in 1962, and the company commander there couldn't write an OER to save his life, and it disadvantaged his lieutenants. I was like, well, that's great, sir. But that's the stuff I get all the time. I mean, these data points from one observation from 1962 that people still think are relevant. And so don't fall guilty for that. Like, you've got to look at this a little bit more broadly than just your experiences, because not everyone has the same experience. And again, you've got to look at what we're doing across the Army. But again, I'll be very interested to hear your comments and your thoughts. Fight against it, because we all tend to default back to our own experiences. Next slide. Guidance and talent management, very, very clear. Everyone says executed from Deputy Secretary of Defense to Secretary Esper and General Milley. It's been very, very clear from the Chief and the Secretary that our guidance is not to take the current system and make minor tweaks to it, but to make the entirely new system and one that is much better. And I'll talk about the way we're trying to get there in a couple slides. Next slide, please. So with a new doctrine and a new concept, I think it is important for us to be clear on our definitions. Talent management has become one of those words that sort of means all things to all people. It has become very buzzwordy. So like cyber, everybody throws cyber, and now it's really cyber, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and talent management. Everyone throws these terms around as if they're something that is new and impactful. It's the new industrial buzzword. This is the way the Army chooses to define talent management. Okay, so talent management is the management of talent across the pillars of acquire, develop, employ, and retain. That's the entire life cycle of an officer. That's our mandate. It's the goal of enhancing Army readiness by maximizing the potential and contribution of our greatest assets, our people. And we define talent as the combination and unique intersection of knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences. You'll hear other people talk about knowledge, skills, attributes. The Army has decided to go with behaviors because we think it is much more important what behaviors you exhibit as opposed to what attributes you have. I'll give you an example. We might be mildly interested if one of your attributes is that you're ethically minded, but we're much more concerned that your behavior is ethical. Okay, so we have defaulted, and you could get a bunch of people in the room, industrial psychologists or behavioral psychologists, and they could have a day-long conference and violently disagree on whether it's an attribute or behavior, but we've gone with behavior, and so that's simple and that's good enough for me. Next slide. So I want to talk you through, and I'm not sure if you've ever seen this before, the math of how we manage the officer corps today. Okay, so this is the model that we all lived on. This has not changed a whole lot over time. Okay, so in the beginning here you see the numbers that we have, and then as you progress through the ranks, the selection rates for each. The numbers in blue are from this initial 4,900, not from there. So when we talk about 44%, that's 44% of the 4,900, not 44% of the 4,450. But we have this attrition-based model that has this initial input of about 5,000 lieutenants from OCS, ROTC, and West Point. This is just the active component. Okay? And then over time, it decreases. What's really important to understand is that by year 11, we need to get rid of 56% of the officers that we have brought in just 11 years before. Okay, just on face value, that's a tremendously wasteful proposition. Like, no company runs a 56% attrition model and is considered a paragon of like human resource management. Okay, like that is a crazy way to do that. It's what we've all grown up with, and again, it bespeaks the industrial. You go to the 5-year commitment, people leave, and I'll talk a little bit more. Then you can see how this winnows down over time. So I'll highlight a couple things. Again, this puts in a tremendous strain on who we bring into the Army, because we have to build into this 56% attrition model by year 11. So one of the things I see is if we can drop that down and be much more focused on who we bring in and determine their proclivity to actually stay in. And I was just talking to the RTC commander. I said, hey, look, if I could drop your sessions number by 1,000, what would that do to how you run ROTC? And he said it would be transformational. Okay, and I'm not saying we're going to be able to get there anytime soon, but all that demand, all that money is spent on people who aren't going to stay in for very long. Okay, the other piece is really interesting as an institution. I'm going to talk about these things. I never thought about these till I was in the job. But how do we determine who we retain? We largely let that system run itself. And what we've said is company commanders, battalion commanders, those closest to the problem, like you can go have a conversation with those officers that you think we should stay in, and you can sort of say, hey, isn't it be great? But frankly, we just sort of let the system run itself. And in 5 years, you leave the Army. Okay, I mean, hey, thanks for your service. We've never chosen to empower those who are closest to the problem, who are the best identifiers of talent, to have any sort of tools beyond a counseling session to say, hey, look, Captain Ham, you are really, really talented. It would be a loss to our Army for you to leave. What can I do to get you to stay in? Like, how can I empower you? How can I help you stay in? Because I think you're a uniquely gifted officer, and your loss from the Army would be a significant loss. We just don't even do that, right? Like, that's all done somewhere else. Okay, so that's one of the unique things. The other thing is we have really no idea how, what we're retaining in terms of whether we're retaining the most talented or the least talented. Okay, because we don't do the assessments, we don't have the data. The only data we have on the people who get in or stay out is a manner of performance score, which is given to you by HRC. It's a numerical number based on their reading of your OERs, but the minute you guys all know this, the minute you as an officer decide you're going to get out of the Army, you start sucking down every center of mass that a battalion commander can give you, because he's not going to waste an above center of mass or a MQ on anybody. And so you've got this but they'll come back and say the people who leave the Army, they've got a lower MOP score than the people who stay in the Army. Well, of course they do, because they suck down at least one, if not two, out of 4 or 5 OERs. And so it's a misleading sort of indicator. Since we don't see our people on a granular level, since we only see them by one variable, which is largely the measure of performance, it's very hard for us to tell. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but a couple of years ago, a gentleman named Tim Kaine wrote a book. It's called Bleeding Talent. It's about how the Army is losing its best and brightest, and specifically the Army. And I would argue that his thesis is impossible to prove or disprove, because we don't collect the right information yet about our people. So one of the things you'll hear me talking about, and you'll see us trying to do, is we're really trying very hard to move from a data poor environment about our people that we live in right now to a data rich one, so we can start saying things like, well, what we're finding is those officers with the highest level of cognition, those officers who are brightest, are leaving at a higher rate than those who are not at high levels of cognition. Those officers with high levels of cross-cultural fluency are departing our service at higher numbers than those who are not. And so we start being able to determine exactly who we're keeping in the Army or not. And right now it's very hard for us to be able to say that. 2 other points for this. You would think in our Army that a situation like this would be able to occur, but it does not, and it cannot with the current system that we have. Okay, so cohort year group 2016 came in with 5,000 second lieutenants. It's 2019, so they are 2 years out from the end of their ADSO. So 5 years out, 2 years out from when they're going to be allowed to depart the Army. You would think at this point there would be a senior leader forum where the senior leaders would come together and they say, look, we have surveyed the class of 2016, the cohort year group class of 2016, and amongst those officers we deem to be in the top 50%, they're going to remain in the Army at this rate, and they're planning on getting out of the Army at this rate. And for those high quality officers who are getting out, who are looking at getting out, they're going to get out for these 3 reasons. So let's, as an Army, pull the levers of institutional power that we possess in order to actively retain those most talented who have already expressed a desire to get out. Okay, so none of that happens. None of it. We don't survey them, we don't have a forum, and we don't ask people why they're getting out so we can get out ahead of this in enough time to pull the levers of institutional power within the Army. What happens is in 2021, there are going to be a bunch of high-quality officers leaving from the class of 26, the cohort year group 2016, and we're all going to sort of be surprised. And it's just not a very good way to run your people and to run that organization. If I was to give it a tactical example, it would be like running a defense, and the only time you knew you were under attack is when the enemy has already breached your concertina wire. Like, we just don't see this stuff out far enough, and we don't do enough things to shape what happens. And then the final piece of this that I think is important to note is that in any future system, what we think is that we want to optimize those 450 colonels and how they get there. It's not about optimizing the 40 brigadier general officers, okay? And here's the reason why. So every year the Army promotes 40 to 42 brigadier generals. 3 years later, half of those brigadier generals have to be out of the Army, just the way we run it right now. So as soon as you get promoted to brigadier general, if you don't get promoted to 2-star, you're out 3 years later. Whereas these 450 colonels that we bring in every year have the ability to stay in and contribute to the Army for a very long period of time. But you look at the way we manage colonels, we don't do a whole lot to incentivize them to stay to the end of their career, even though we've invested a tremendous amount into their development as an officer at that point. And they're the ones who are doing the hard work on the Joint Staff at OSD, on the Army staff, on combatant command staffs, and we don't tend to look at it that way. But I would think that any future system needs to be optimized to create really, really high quality with a diverse set of talents at the colonel rank at the end of that, from which we can pluck out a very small number in order to make them general officers, and that will take care of itself. But I think the future system will be optimized around the creation of really exceptional colonels. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how do we take this current system and take it from where we are today and get it to where we want to be tomorrow? And this is at least our visual to help describe, okay? So what we do is we're going to describe the current system here on the left. What you see is it's got very standardized career paths. So it doesn't matter whether you're an infantry officer or a cyber officer or a transportation corps officer, you all get promoted the same year. You all effectively have to do roughly the same jobs, and it all looks very, very similar. And frankly, anything that looks dissimilar, our Army does a great job of really not treating that very well. So you see all these things happen where the Army contorts itself to make everything look like it fits within an IBCT and an ABCT. Just take a look at the CSL and how we run that. Explain to me why a public affairs officer needs to be a central selection, central selection. Okay, it's because when these boards meet, they all need to sort of look like they fit within an IBCT or an ABCT. And it's really tough for us to recognize that there's different sort of fields and that not everything fits within that model. So we had a very standardized career path. There are some strengths of the current system, and I don't want to take it away. So most people would say it's tremendously fair, it's been scalable, it's predictable, it's developmental, which is really one of the great strengths of the Army. This developmental model that I think some of us take for granted sometimes is almost unmatched by any other service or industry. And it's tremendously resilient. No one anticipated when OPMS 21 was written in 1998 that we'd be going through about 20 years of land war in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it weathered those storms very well. But as this has been worked and used, we can just see all sorts of things that are becoming weaknesses with it. So it's highly centralized, very tough to adapt to new developments. It's data poor. The major variable that we manage our officer corps with is time only. And so we just understand there's some areas that are really ripe for change. So if you look at what we want to go to in the future, I think we can start to describe it by some, all the study that we've been able to do. So it really needs to be embedded with flexible career paths. And then it's got to be underpinned by 3 foundational areas. So one is the management of the assignment of the officers in terms of how we move them around and what we do with them. Okay, the second is the organizational structure for how we manage the strategic direction of our officer corps. It was really interesting when you dig into it, but you look at all the different organizations that impact the strategic direction of the officer corps, and there really is no unity of effort, let alone unity of command on how that happens. So from the G3, from TRADOC, from the chief to the vice, to the G1, to CAC, I mean, all these different organizations, all of whom work for different people, cause this tremendous disaggregation of authorities for the management of our officer corps. And then there needs to be a process over time that helps inform our senior leaders of where we are moving out in a strategic direction as an officer corps. We want to keep all the things that are strengths of the Army and move these over here, but we want to establish some other things to include having a marketplace for assignments, make it much more data rich. Leveraging technology is probably the least sexy, but maybe one of the most important things. Okay, so we effectively have no predictive capability for the management of our officer corps. Okay, so if the chief tomorrow said, I want to make every company command be a mandatory 3-year company command, we don't have any programs or system where we could plug that in and we could say, well, sir, you can do that, but the impact is going to be the wait for KD time as majors is now going to be 3 years, and this is going to impact the way you make battalion and brigade commanders down the road. We have nothing that really allows us to do that in a very effective fashion. It is just a minor stretch to say that most of the officer corps is managed by Excel spreadsheet. Okay, and much of the software that you're seeing run in different places in your personnel enterprise were written on code that was written in the late 80s and early 90s. Okay, that's how modern our system is today, and it's badly in need of some modernization. So how do we get there? So the chief and the secretary have given us a mandate to begin a number of pilots and prototypes in order to figure out with smaller subsets of the officer corps how we're going to change these models and how we're going to establish new processes. We're in the process of executing those pilots and prototypes, which I'll describe to you. But we see each of those on these 4 major bridges to driving us to information that's going to help create a new system. So the one is the Army Talent Alignment process, which is going on right now. So starting on the 1st of October of this year, the new assignment process for everyone who is in that movement cycle will be like nothing you've ever seen before. So the Army will determine which jobs are going to become open, as we do, because we have more open jobs than we have people that we can put in. So the Army, through these processes, will determine who is going, what positions are going to be filled, and then that will be entered into what we call the marketplace. The officers who are going to be moved are going to be incentivized to fill out, make sure their ORBs on the front side are accurate, but then on the back side, they've got the ability to fill out a resume, which goes into a deep level of information about everybody, talk about these knowledge, skills, behaviors, and your preferences. You get to have work references. You get to have these all this other information that you're able to find out about yourself and profess about yourself. Units have to describe the positions that are coming open within them. So, not all Brigade S3 and Battalion S3 jobs are the same. You may be you may be looking for Battalion S3 and taking your battalion to Korea. You may want to have some skill sets that are different than if you were going to go to Kuwait, or you may have a different one. If really your focus for the next year as a battalion commander is just to get your motor pool operations up and running. You may be looking for a different officer, even though it's the same position. You've got the ability to describe that. When the market opens, every unit can see every officer that's available, and every officer can see every job that is open. No more black book assignments, no more shotgun assignments, no more, there's no more, it's complete transparency for every job opening. And then you as an officer get to go in and you get to do a preference of every job that is available there. You can take it as long as you want to. There are 200 jobs, you can go 1 to 200, or you can go to 1 to 50. And you can signal to units where you want to go. Units then get a chance to look at everyone who's interested in them. They also get to see the whole inventory, so if they see someone they're interested in, they can actively recruit them. Then they get to see who prefers them, and then they make a match in terms of what their preferences are amongst those candidates, and then we run an algorithm that then matches these people. It effectively moves the assignment officer out of this process, except for when there is a market failure, or they need to intervene for things like the Married Armies Couple Program or the Exceptional Family Members Program, or some other things that we would call a market failure. But the idea and the very clear guidance is to get the assignment officer out of the process and let units and individuals run this in a new fashion. So we're empowering commanders to begin hiring their own people. So that's coming at us very, very rapidly. We're actually going through a series of meetings with proponents and all the other involved to make sure that we have created enough flexibility within the system so we can do this in a much more flexible fashion. Second is the beginning of assessments in order to start getting more and better information about our officer corps. Okay, so our system today is run primarily on evaluations. So an evaluation is, I as a brigade commander looked at my company commanders and I evaluated them in a subjective fashion. The rubric that I used in my head, the method that I used was probably dramatically different than the second brigade commander to my right. He did something different. He had a rank order. But we are allowed by the Army to be very, very subjective in the way that we do. The Army doesn't say it's got to be 15% based on PT score, 20% based on tactical, 50, there's nothing like that. Like you're able to do that. I don't think that's ever going to go away from the Army, and I think it's always going to play a central and majority role in what we're and how we're looking at our officer corps. What we're trying to do is augment it, though, with objective data that comes from an assessment. Okay, so we're all used to assessments. We just are not used to thinking about assessments that deal with things like, what your makeup is as a person. So the assessment we're all familiar with is the APFT, right? Like you take an APFT, that is clearly an assessment. You take an APFT in Korea, you take an APFT in Kuwait, and it is the exact same standards, it's the exact same events, and you get a score which is highly related to how you do in those different events. So what we're beginning to do is launch a series of assessments to better see the talents within our officer corps. So starting in July, every captain in the captain's career course is going to take a GRE. We're going to use that GRE to help determine who should be eligible for ACS and who should be eligible for certain VTIPs. We're also going to begin the experimentation with a comprehensive captain's assessment about their cognition in order to figure out, what their levels of intelligence are. And intelligence is a really tricky thing. There's like narrow intelligence and broad intelligence, and all these tests are helping to get more insight into our officer corps. We think what will happen is in the junior ranks, say lieutenant to captain, this is all pre-approval, that will be largely for you to be developed as an officer, and then for the Army to sort of see what the trends are. So we call it developmental if it's for the individual, diagnostic if it's for the institution. So, infantry may know, infantry branch may find out that their captains there have really low levels of writing, and so we need to start changing the curriculum to reflect that infantry officers need to be better writers. But most of that information is going to come to you for your own development. But at a certain point, we haven't figured out when, that's going to start switching, and we're going to start using the assessments to start determining what jobs you can go to. Okay, and we think these assessments are best done in conjunction with our professional education program. So at the Captain's Career Course, CGSC, and War College are the places we're going to try to put these in to be able to get this information. But now you can start seeing how we're seeing our officer corps in a very, very different way. And now all of a sudden that gives you the potential of start building teams in a very different way. So, today we would say, hey, we're getting an infantry brigade commander, let's make sure we get an artillery XO, and let's make sure we get an S3 who's an armor guy because it's a combined arms brigade or something like that. You could really start saying, well, okay, hey, look, you've got this, Jones guy coming as brigade commander. He's really smart, but he's really low on the openness scale. So let's give him a DCO who's really high on the openness scale, who's really good at cross-cultural fluency, and then let's get him an S3 who can, backstop the fact that the commander's not particularly organized. And you can start seeing how we can build teams based on different variables other than what your branch is in your last job. And that's what happens when you start seeing your office score at a much more granular level. Assessments play a big role in having that visibility. Talked a little bit about career paths. That's with the Army talent alignment process as well. So those two are sort of built in. But this idea of we need to have much greater flexibility. Officers need to have much greater ownership of the decisions that they make about their own careers, and we need to be comfortable that it's not always going to be on the exact conveyor belt sort of model. And so I could imagine going forward, again, all pre-decisional, that in the future it looks like this. Hey, Captain Smith, you're now an infantry captain at 5 years. You can be an infantry captain for 5 years at the shortest and for 10 years at the longest. And in that period, you need to do two things. You need to go to the Captain's Career Course, and you need to command a company for 18 months. After that, it is sort of, you can do other things. You can go to West Point, you can go to the Ranger Regiment. You've got time within and that's not going to be held against you as you go forward, as opposed to, hey, you have to be looked at promotion for major at year 10. But that's easy to say, hard to do with our current system. And then finally, promotions and selections, which is really the keys to the kingdom. But it is impossible to imagine a new officer management system with the current promotion and selection system, because that really is one of the key motivators. We all want to progress within our profession. We want to be selected for certain jobs. We want to be promoted up in rank as we go along. And so we're looking at ways doing things differently. So one of the things we're doing differently, like right now, like next month, is let me just explain to you the current system so you can understand what a changes is going to be. So the current system, we hold a central selection board for battalion command. Board convenes, officers are selected. There's a primary list and there's an alternate list. Okay, and everyone, when they're looked at the board, they all get a score. Top scores for how many battalions? Let's just say it's 50 infantry battalions within within the cohort. 50 infantry battalions. Those guys go to the primary, and then about 25 people get selected to be on the alternate list. So we have contacted everyone who is on the infantry and armor alternate list right now. We have told them that they have to report to Fort Benning for 1 of 2 periods, one in June, one in July. They will go through a 5-day assessment program down there to include scored and screening events. And at the end of that, we will reestablish what the order of merit list is amongst those candidates who went through a much more rigorous look at them as officers. And that is including an assessment of their strategic potential, a writing sample, and an APFT. Those are all scored events. There's also going to be a psychological screening similar to what happens in some special operations units to weed out any people who probably shouldn't be in command, as well as a board of senior leaders who are going to have who are going to sit down and talk. Those final two, the psychological screening of the board, mostly are just viewed as a screening thing. You're not going to be scored on those because that's probably not appropriate or right, but it's just sort of a pass-fail, with most people being able to pass unless something egregiously pops up that is bad. But the idea is, if we take a deeper look into our officer corps, we're going to come up with some different decisions, and we'll see if we get a different OML out of that than what the Central Selection Board, and then we'll recommend to the chief and the secretary what we want to do with that data after we're done doing that. And we're also looking at promotion boards and how that might be different under a talent management system. Next slide. So very quickly, in August 2019, the NDA authorities given to us are the biggest changes since at least 1980, if not earlier. So we've got the ability to do direct commissioning up to 06, and that's concurrent with the repeal of the age limit. So we can start harnessing private sector expertise and bring that in. The chief and the secretary have said, the chief specifically said, you bring in anyone at any branch or any functional area, to include infantry officers, if we can find qualified people from places like the UK or Australia. Brevet promotions, the Army has 770 captain to colonel positions. What that means is if you are selected through a board process to go into one of those positions, you're a lieutenant colonel going into a colonel's position. As soon as you arrive in that position, you're promoted to colonel and you're paid as a colonel in order to do that job. It's something the Navy's been doing for a while, and we view it as a way of incentivizing either going into critical jobs or hard-to-fill jobs. 504, we've got a merit-based promotion list. So very quickly, it goes right now. You go to a promotion board. There's an order of merit list that comes out based on your scores. Those are irrelevant to how we sequence the promotions. We revert back to data rank. Under this new system, we're going to take a look at all the scores. We're going to run an algorithm on it, and we're going to find what are the top cluster of scores where there's a natural break between the top performers and the rest. Those top performers will be promoted based on the sequence on the OML, and it will revert back to data rank on the rest of the officer corps. We think that recognizes those who are top performers and then keeps it not cutthroat competition for everyone else. And we also think that won't stigmatize officers who get promoted later on who would be lower on the OML if they don't show up at a unit, and it would be very clear where they had ranked on that. Working through right now how to execute the opting out of a promotion board. If you're doing something of high value for the Army, right now we're looking at things like whether you're a teacher up at West Point, an instructor pilot down at Fort Rucker, some other positions within cyber and within SF, you can opt out of a promotion board so you can have longer time. It's interesting when you do this. It's mostly not about missing the promotion board that you're about to face, like if you're a captain looking for major, but it's to give you more time between major and, say, lieutenant colonel, so you can get more KD time and make yourself more competitive. So sometimes it's a little counterintuitive. It's not about the immediate board generally, but it's about the board afterwards, so you've got some more built-in time. 40 years time in service has now been extended to captains to lieutenant colonels. The secretary has an alternate promotion authority that he can use and designate candidates like people who are in PhD programs, for example. And then these last are on the Guard and the Reserve, but this is about management of the IRR. And then the final one is federal recognition, in which if there's a delay in the recognition of a National Guard promotion because of the way the federal government has done it, it can revert back to when the state submitted it. Next slide. And this is the last one. So here's what's happening coming out right now. So the battalion commander's assessments beginning the 10th to the 14th of June, working through effective this federal recognition for promotion of National Guard officers. Starting in July, the GRE is going to be instituted across the Captain's Career Course. Tentatively, in July, we're going to have the new policy approved for how to opt out of promotion boards. In July, we're going to have merit-based promotion boards in effect with the Majors Board, second iteration of battalion commander's assessment in the end of July. In August, we're going to direct commission approximately 10 cyber officers. Most interestingly, the first 04 that we've ever been able to direct commission. By the 1st of October, all officers will be involved in this new assignment process, which we're actually calling the Army Talent Alignment Process, and then AUSA annual meeting. The theme we understand for this is going to be talent management for the Army. So you're going to hear a lot more about this. And then working on a schedule to get the brevet promotion pieces put together after that. I think that's my last slide. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. So I went a little long. I apologize. But what questions do you have? Sure.
The slide that said that the current system is fair and you want to keep fair, fair to a point, but then you did mention black books and whatnot, and certainly have benefited from the black book process. But how do you see breaking general officers of their knowledge of black books and, relying on that system and stuff? So it's fair if you can work your way into that system, but for those who necessarily didn't get, pulled into that, it doesn't, they don't.
Okay, well, so it's a great question, because how do you create a new system that doesn't piss off the highest ranking people who benefit from the black book system? And so what's really interesting is in this system we have right now, you have de facto created that. So let's say I wanted you to come work for me in my next job, and I contacted you and said, Karen, look, in this next assignment cycle, I want you to put your number one job as working for me as my division G3, whatever it is. And I said, if you do that, I'll make you the number one pick. If you've got that one-to-one pick, it's almost going to be impossible to break. Okay, so you've effectively given people the ability to do a BNR systemically within it, so you don't need to have it. But the damage of the BNR is it just works around the system and it corrodes people's trust within the system, because if you don't have a market that's transparent, then everybody sort of thinks you're getting, there's all these side deals that are being done. The BNR system is a de facto black market system that sort of undermines the current system to some degree. But you've still got the ability to do it as a commander. But here's what prototypes have found out, specifically in the officer corps, is we would enter into this and I'd be, hey, look, I'm really going to hire Karen to come onto my team. And, because I only know a couple people. But then when I look at the qualities of all the applicants out there, I'm like, well, I really think the world of Karen, but you know what? There's someone who's a lot better qualified, so I'm going to hire Randy instead. And that happened time and time again when we did. It's always a good choice to hire Randy, but that happened time and time again with the engineers when they were doing that. And really, it just makes sense, right? Like if even for these jobs, we only know a certain number of people, but if you get to have visibility on everybody, then you get a whole lot of different outcomes. And one of the things we're trying to work, and I don't want to overpromise this, is we're trying to build within the software the ability for me to say, hey, I'm really interested in Karen, and much like you have in Amazon, I say, hey, look, if you're interested in Karen, here are 4 other people you should consider, because you may not know them or even heard of them, but they've got really similar qualities, and you may want to consider their availability to come and work for you as well. And I think that's where all this can start taking us. Okay, what other questions?
As you're running you showed that timeline slide with a whole lot of initiatives that need to be managed, obviously, and under our current COMO apparatus, the HRC apparatus, and to what extent are those folks plugged into you to stay apprised of all these bow waves? I say that because they're your actuators, and,
yeah, that's exactly right.
And as you know, they have their own cultures and things that have been passed on through signal branch or the dental corps, and there's a lot of old stuff baggage out there so what's your kind of command information pulse?
So 2 different pieces, and because it's a little bit more complicated. So let's just talk proponent pieces, right? So proponents play an outsized role in the management of the officer corps because they're established what the career maps are, what the KD qualifications are, and what those things are. Just yesterday, we began a conversation with all the proponent leads, hosted by Dr. Rudinsky, the ASA MNRA, and General Lundy, actually his deputy, to begin the discussion that says we are changing these, we are making these more flexible, and we are not going to continue doing we've got to start looking at how to create flexibility. And then over the next 8 weeks, we're going to have a series of discussions with each of the proponent chiefs in smaller groups, like IO, Cyber, and FA 26 managers with us. And they've got to come and say, hey, look, here is a rule that we want to establish and for the management. And the first question is going to have to be, you need to justify it. you need to justify why you need to have this level of inflexibility. And sometimes there's good reasons and not, but it can't just be the sort of accumulated habit that we have right now. And so we're trying to break through that. So when we open up this marketplace on the 1st of October, a lot of these restricting rules have been eliminated. So that's a big piece. Working with HRC, we work with HRC every single day. I mean, we're a small team right now. We're about 40. We're going to grow to 70 by the end of the summer. In fact, HRC, a lot of the people in ASA and all these different organizations, they've got all the professional expertise because they've been doing it forever, and they've got all the data. So we've got to do this collaboratively, and so we're working this stuff together. And certainly there's a back and forth and push back and forth as we do this. But it's working as well as it could work, which I think is pretty good. Okay.
Sir, Colonel Anthony Kim, Army Medical Service Corps Officer. You mentioned about the GRE and Captain's Career Course. Question there is, how do you intend to catch the officers that have already completed the course, and how do you assess them compared? Because not all of us would go to be selected for command or the next step of process in our career path at the same time. We go to a Captain's Career Course at different times. The second question would be...
So, I mean, it's not going to be held against you if you don't have it.
Okay.
We're just starting in July, so,
Yes, sir.
if you graduated in April, you just don't have it.
Okay. Sir, also, how would you incorporate the non-competitive category selections, CSL? Because I'm an Army Medical Corps officer, not competing against the Army competitive category in the talent management timeline.
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking.
The Army competitive category,
Sure.
a different timeline in boards selections compared to non-competitive, the Army medical officers, JAG, and the Chaplain Corps. So I saw different timelines, different milestones on your timeline for how would you incorporate, what considerations do you have for the non-competitive category in the talent management?
So our focus right now is on the ACC, and we've got representatives from all the other branches. You're talking about chaplains, lawyers, doctors. They're watching, and then I think we're going to focus on the ACC first, and then we're going to see how that bleeds over to the other ones.
Sir, Major Richie Sands, I'm a congressional fellow. You brought up the point, which I thought was an excellent one, about commanders are going to start picking their people because now they can be fully held accountable for their organizations when they're picking their team. Counter argument to that could be it could bring back a good old boy system. Right now, a lot of the data points that are collected at these CSLs are retained at the board level. So what's the plan to get that data down to those commanders so they can pick their team with the complementary parts you talked about based on these kind of evaluations that you're doing at Camp's Career Course and other schools?
Yeah, so we're not there yet. So the last part of that is easy, which is we don't have the data yet to be able to start building teams like that. I just sort of trying to give you an idea of what this could evolve to over the next couple of years as we start doing that. And you're right. I mean, it's an issue. If we start empowering commanders to pick their own teams, what are the things we need to guard against? So one of the things we need, I mean, I would say the first things that come to mind is, one, we've got to guard against, over-empowering a brigade commander who then picks nothing but rock stars, and then 50% of those rock stars have no future in the Army anymore because, he's got a force distribution system, and it doesn't matter whether he's in Vicenza, Italy, he's still got to give an HQ to half of his officers. And so, part of this is teaching commanders on the responsibility that they have and how they're going to execute it. So that's first. And the other one, we're very interested in finding a way to start tagging that sort of data to find out that, Colonel McEwen hasn't worked for me 16 times in the past, and I keep on hiring her, and finding ways to start elevating it. We have not answered. We know that's a question we need to answer in terms of how we manage that. We don't have a firm answer yet. We know we're going to try to have it figured out by the 1st of October. There's going to be some really negative pieces that come from that. I'll just tell you a quick story about this hiring thing because it's a very different thing, right? Like as a brigade commander, when I was brigade commander, I mean, people just showed up. I think I dropped one BNR, but we're just used to this very centralized system where the big Army just gives you a group of people. This is going to change the role of commanders and how they build their teams, and they've got to be much more involved. I was at Leavenworth. I'm actually heading to Leavenworth as soon as I'm done here to talk to PCC, and I had dinner with a bunch of these officers and a brigade commander. He said, I don't get it. You're going to allow me to hire people, but what are you taking off my plate? Because all I see that is additive work, and I got extra work now, and you haven't given me any more people, and you haven't taken anything off my plate. Before I could even answer, the guy who's going to command the Ranger Regiment next cut in. He said, "Are you crazy?" He said, you know what it means to be given the power to hire your own teams? He goes, it's the most important thing you will do as a brigade commander. It's where you should dedicate the majority of your energy if you want to execute this well. He goes, this is not like a burden that the Army's put. This is a tremendous opportunity the Army's given to you. And I tend to think he's exactly right.
Sir, Captain Tyler Fitzgerald.
I probably have time for two more. I'm still not quite that tight. Okay. But I appreciate it, Bradley.
I think another system that seems fairly antiquated is the 3-year PCS cycle, and I was wondering if the task force had any plans for assessing the cycle, which for officers is really typically 18 months or 2 years, and how much that could actually benefit officers or detract from them compared to, say, being stationed at Bragg or Campbell, going to career course, and then coming back there.
Yeah, I think those things are all on the table. It hasn't, so the issue of timelines and how long you're at a place becomes a little bit, so the short answer is we know we've got to get there. We know we've got to work it. It hasn't been the initial focus because we've been doing a lot of these other things. But we know that's going to, so the question is, it's 2 years, 3 years, is that the right model? Should an officer be able to stick around 5 years on a base if they want to? There's a very real geographic component to the way our officers have preferences and where they want to be, right? So, like, you can say, sure, you can stay for 5 years at places, but then you clog up places like Vicenza, Fort Carson, Fort Lewis, Hawaii, those places where everybody wants to be stationed, and the data will show you that that's where everybody wants to go. But then what happens, to the people who are at Fort Polk, Fort Bliss, some of these Korea, these places that are definitely shown by just by individual preferences that people don't want to, and so we don't have an answer yet for how you manage that. Certainly, there should be greater ownership by officers in terms of their ability to do that. And you think about that linking to like a spouse's career and the jobs that they have, how that would be a direct linkage. It's just a really, really difficult problem because of the numbers that we're dealing with, and then how you manage that across the Army. So we've got that. We just have not dug into that yet, but we will. Okay. Yeah.
Sir, Kurt Leffler, a War College Fellow at CSIS. As you look at what the Chief and General Murray and so on are doing as far as modernizing the Army, changing doctrinal concepts, operational concepts for near-peer competition, you want to develop, kind of get into your change bullet on culture there. Mm-hmm. You want to develop a spirit of innovation among those junior folks. Where are the touch points and the levers in this system that you're building to change the Army kind of bottom up, to make it more adaptive, more dynamic, bring in new ideas as we change Big Army?
I don't know if we've done or I've done so how is that going to happen? So, I think you're bringing in innovative young officers as they come in, as they normally are. I think it's fostering that culture of innovation throughout a time. But I think at a certain point, being in the Army, it doesn't, I don't know if the Army right now has done enough to foster that innovative spirit. There's all sorts of reasons why too, right? Like, you don't want to be innovative in the middle of a battlefield necessarily because, that's not the time to be experimenting. I think it's necessary. I think one of the ways that we can start improving that or helping with that is with this infusion of talent laterally, people coming from the civilian world who may be bringing a new perspective for a couple of years, wearing a uniform, and then go back out. I think another thing we could do that is just an interesting observation, we take in these high-quality 18-year-olds. We send them to places like ROTC or to West Point or even OCS. We invest then 9 years in their development, right? And then they want to go off and do something different. And the attitude in the Army is, hey, hit the bricks, you're a quitter. We don't really have the mindset of, hey, go out and work for 5 years, and then why don't you come back? Because you're probably going to learn something new at what other company, and we may actually want to use those skill sets. It really, if you just step back, and again, I grew up in this exact same system. Think about what these people are learning. They're still Army officers at their core, right? Like, you've enculturated them for 9 years. We've invested as a nation in them for 9 years. And then you couldn't bring those guys back later as a senior captain or as a major and let them pick up. Maybe you wouldn't want them to command a rifle company or something like that, but they probably could provide some value. But we just sort of, blind ourselves to that ability. And if you really look at the system, we do a bunch of stuff like that. I like to raise this example. So at the end of battalion command, in what year would have been 2010, if I had said, you know what, I've deployed a lot, it's been tough on my family, and I would love to move back home to California. I've been a successful battalion commander in the Army. I'd like to move back to California. I'd like to be closer to home, but I still want to serve my country, and I want to serve in the California Army National Guard, okay? the Army would have said, well, that's a great idea. We'd love to have you in the California National Guard. There's just one small wrinkle. You have to forfeit your retirement pay. I mean, what sense does that make? I mean, these barriers that we've put in that just are just, you know, in all of this sort of just built in that just make, if you really look at it, are just counterintuitive to the way we should be employing talent in a much more flexible and permeable way of looking at how we use it. And I think these are all opportunities for us to you know, make an Army that is much better because we're able to bring these people in or let these people transition out. Okay. Oh yeah, if you could. So if you could please just take a couple minutes. We're getting great data from this, but every time I go and I go to one of these things, this is our informal, I guess it's become increasingly formal, but we run the data on this. And I won't tell you the interesting information that's come out of it so far, but if you could fill it out. It really helps to put the DoD ID number on there. We're not going to track you down and try, unless you want us to. We give you an opportunity so we can come back if you have any questions. But it does allow us to say, hey, this is what captains are thinking, this is what infantry captains are thinking. I mean, it's a great tool, and the way we can slice the data is fairly compelling. Okay, so thank you very much, sir. It's always great to be here and great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you very, very much. Okay, so pretty exciting year ahead, I think. And this has changed that, you know, the Talent Management Task Force is kind of setting the conditions, but as with all things, this change is going to be led from within. It's going to be led by you. And so your interest, your understanding, your feedback, I think will be quite instructive as the Army moves forward. So thanks for joining us this morning for a very interesting conversation. Be interesting to see how this goes on over time. We've got for each of you a folder with some of the Institute for Land Warfare and Association products. We'd encourage you to take those with you. And I would just I'd be remiss if I didn't, as a president of AUSA, say that these events like this are possible because we have members. And so if you're not an AUSA member, I'd encourage you to stop by the desk and see Ms. Christine Lathrop there. It'll take about a minute to sign up, and we certainly welcome your membership and your support. Thanks for joining us this morning. Best wishes for those of you who are nearing the completion of your fellowships and moving on to other things. Well, congratulations, and the Army awaits your leadership once again. So thank you all for joining us this morning. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Great.